Every single day since the end of the 2023 season, I have been refreshing ESPN's Football Power Index page to see if they have updated it for the 2024 season. And much like previous iterations of FPI, the current iteration, and future versions, there will be, as the famous saying goes, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this also goes for other websites, whether it's ESPN and their analysts making predictions, or CBS, 24/7 Sports, which I know is a affiliate of CBS, but whatever, you get the point. There will always be good and bad predictions, and we can only fully determine what's the good, the bad, and the ugly at the end of the season, as hindsight's 2020. But something that I've taken notice of that's growing in popularity, and that has really been popular since the beginning of the 2024 season, right after Michigan beat Washington, as there is no offseason, that's heresy, is this idea that Oregon and Texas will waltz into their new conferences and dominate and compete for championships, both national and conference. Now, Oregon and Texas, out of all the schools in conference realignment, are the best suited to do that. But conference realignment is tough, historically, on anyone, even a blue blood like Nebraska. And along with this idea that Oregon and Texas will compete for conference and national championships, includes predictions, like the one that FPI is making by ranking Oregon and Texas ahead of Ohio State, that the Ducks and the Longhorns will be superior teams to the Buckeyes. And I don't think the data, the history, the information, the statistics, I don't think much of anything agrees with that sentiment. So we're going to be talking about that opinion specifically, comparing Ohio State, Oregon, and Texas, and why I think it's a grave mistake to undervalue the Buckeyes in comparison to these teams on this episode of College Football with Sam. Before we dive any deeper, I want to briefly encourage you to do something very important for me, and that is liking this video, hitting that thumbs up button to help get us into the algorithm and continue to produce more amazing college football content, especially as it pertains to the Big Ten. And also, please subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell so that you can get notified when I release more college football content, and comment who you think will be the best out of these three teams, Oregon, Texas, or Ohio State. Who do you think is the best shot of winning it all? Who do you think has the best chance of winning their conference? Who do you think will be the best? And do you agree with my opinion that Ohio State very likely will be better than these two schools? Or do you disagree and think that Ohio State will maybe have their worst year under Ryan Day? Or maybe they'll be good, but Texas and Oregon will just be that much better. Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. And last but not least, before we resume, please check out my Patreon page and my merchandise store via the links in the description and in the pinned comment if you want to support the channel in an extra way. I will shout out all Patreon members at the end of every video, and in my live streams, I will consistently wear my own merchandise, as it's very comfortable and good quality. And this video relates to ESPN's FPI, so if you have not seen this video already, my video that I released 8 days ago, documenting ESPN's FPI and things that I agree with, disagree with, the good, the bad, and the ugly, check that out through the link in the top right corner of the screen. It's a good watch, it's doing well, and it's a very engaging video. But let's get back to the topic. And I want to start out with the Oregon Ducks, because Oregon is probably my favorite team in terms of odds to win it all. Who's moving conferences? USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington are moving to the Big Ten, and Texas and Oklahoma, they're moving to the SEC, and Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah are moving to the Big 12. Those are the moves of the Power 5 to Power 4 from 2023 to 2024. Also, don't forget Cal, Stanford, and SMU moving to the ACC. Out of all those teams, I think Oregon is the best by quite a significant margin entering this year. They were 12-2 last year. Their strength of schedule was not tough, but they were dominant. I remember watching their game against Utah last year. Now, Utah is a team who will always play you close if they can. They never quit. They're tough on defense. They're good in the trenches, and they were banged up last year. But playing in Rice-Eccles Stadium is no easy task. It's loud, dedicated fan base, and Utah is deep, even with their recruiting classes that pale in comparison to Oregon's. Oregon went in there and just destroyed that team, made it look easy. I think the final score was 35-6 or something like that. 12-2, they were fourth in FPI, the second most efficient team in the country. Efficiency is just measuring how the offense, defense, and special teams perform relative to the opponent offense, defense, and special teams. So if you're a dominant team like Oregon, even if you lose to Washington twice, who went 14-1, if you score more points, allow less points, and are just more of a dominant team, you will be ranked ahead of teams that you lose to, even maybe more than once in FPI. That's how FPI works. It cares more about dominance and more about, I'd say, relative performance, if that's the correct word, and statistics and analytics rather than necessarily straight up record. It's why 2021 Nebraska, for example, was nearly ranked top 25 despite being 3-9, because they had a very tough schedule and played all of these near elite to elite teams close. Oregon was still competitive with Washington in their two losses. They got physically dominated a bit, but they were able to respond and at points were favored to win the game by FPI, by win probability. And they won all their other 12 games in pretty dominant fashion. They toyed around with Liberty in the bowl game. They destroyed Colorado, wrecked that hype train. And even when they played a below average game relative to their ceiling against USC, they still looked like a cat and made USC look like a mouse. Their strength of schedule was not strong by any means, but they had a top 5 offense and defense per ESPN's efficiency and also scoring, and that was last season. And they returned nearly 3/4, more than 2/3 of production from last year, and they bring in 14 transfers. 6 starters on offense, including elite offensive tackles, Josh Connerly Jr., and a Johnny Cornelius return. Jordan James, who was basically the Donovan Edwards to Blake Corum at Oregon last year. Oregon's running back room was that good. Jordan James comes back when Bucky Irving leaves to the NFL, which he's been drafted already. Tez Johnson comes back, and he'll be wide receiver number 1 as Troy Franklin departs. Dylan Gabriel, he's not a returning starter, but one of the best QBs in the nation. He's transferring in. Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon transferring at defensive tackle. Those are some of the best defensive tackles. Jamari Caldwell was one of the best in the Big 12. Derek Harmon was definitely a good defensive tackle in the Big 10. I don't know if I'd say one of the best, but he certainly would have been one of the best in the Pac-12 last season, and he'll be great for Oregon. They return Jordan Birch, and this is just a really good, deep team. They're well coached, they're physical. Dan Lanning is still young, much like Sarkisian, much like Day. All 3 of these head coaches we're talking about in today's video are fairly young. Lanning, I'd say, is the youngest. Sarkisian and Day have been in the head coaching business for over 5 years. Sarkisian even longer than that. Dan Lanning's only been a head coach for 2 seasons. But learning under Kirby Smart, I really like him. He's bringing SEC Big Ten caliber players to the Ducks. I think they'll be very successful in the Big Ten in the long run, maybe even in the short run. I think out of all the teams that are going to new conferences, Oregon has the best shot of being competitive and of dominating their conference in the short run. Their strengths are quarterback with Gabriel, running back with Jordan James, Noah Whittington, wide receiver with Evan Stewart, with Tez Johnson, with Gary Bryant. Their offensive center position, I think, is going to be strong this year. Offensive tackle in particular, again, with Josh Connerly Jr. and a Johnny Cornelius, I really like. Ipani Lalolu is their projected starting center. Jordan Birch and Mateo Uyunglele, I think, will form a great edge group as well. Guard could be a strength, but they lost production on that interior of the O-line. Defensive tackle with Harmon and Caldwell could also be a strength. And Oregon bringing in Jabbar Muhammad, returning Taisheem Powell, and others in that secondary. that could be strong as well. Their weakness, and this is not necessarily a weakness, I think it's more of a weak link, is Jeffrey Bassa and Justin Jacobs at linebacker. But that's, again, I think more of a weak link than a weakness. The defense is filled with transfers, and last year, they were good, they were great, but I think that strength of schedule and the fact that they were just so dominant that teams had to play catch-up with them contributed to that defense being ranked so high. I think that defense, relative to its ranking, was closer to a paper tiger than being legitimately top 10. And again, I could be wrong, but Washington pushed them around. Washington's defense was able to mess with that offense. And the Big Ten defenses are much better than Washington's defense was last year. And there are several defenses this season, whether it's Ohio State or Michigan or Wisconsin or USC. I know Oregon doesn't play USC, or Penn State, but Oregon could maybe play these teams in the playoff or in Indianapolis for the Big Ten championship game. Those offenses have the potential to be as physical and tactical as Washington's was last season. So the defense for Oregon, I'd say overall, is somewhat of a question mark relative to being championship caliber. The offense is awesome, but given that they're moving into a new conference and their defense is questionable, which Ohio State's isn't, and some of that inexperience at head coach, Dan Lanning's game management has arguably bit Oregon in the butt against ranked opponents. Oregon State in 2022, Washington in 22, and both times in 23. I do have a hard time seeing this team being given, I don't exactly know how to put this, but it's almost like they're being given credit that they haven't achieved yet. Like, give it a year. But comparing Oregon to Ohio State, I find to be much more favorable to the Ducks than comparing the Longhorns to the Buckeyes in regards to the Longhorns. For Texas, they were also 12-2 last year. They went to the college football playoff, unlike Oregon, unlike Ohio State. They beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa, and they should earn their flowers there. They were ranked 7th in FPI last year, 6th in efficiency. They played the 12th best strength of schedule, top 20 offense, top 10 defense per ESPN's efficiency. They were, I think, 15th in both scoring offense and scoring defense from what I remember, which is kind of cool. Like 15th exactly. And if you're 15th in both scoring offense and scoring defense, just averaging out those numbers, you're probably going to be a top 10 team, unless college football has a super balanced year and the top 10 teams typically have both top 10 offenses and defenses, which is rare. Normally, there aren't many college football teams who are that balanced. Last year was one of those seasons, though. There were several teams last year who had elite ceilings, and teams last year that could have contended for GOAT status. Michigan, Georgia, part of me would argue Ohio State if things went a different way, but they didn't, and maybe Oregon. Maybe, not by analytics, but just solely by achievement and coaching up, Washington. Those 5 teams had elite potential. Many of them had GOAT potential, depending on what you considered a GOAT team. This season, I think, is going to be a down year, and Texas returns 2/3 of their production, a lot from an offense that had a very high ceiling, and a defense that, while certainly wasn't elite, particularly at defending the pass, their D-line being coached by Bo Davis was legendary, with Sweat and Murphy on that interior. And often the defense at times made the play, even if they were getting gouged. There were several times late in the season where, whether it was Kansas State coming back, forcing Texas into overtime, but Texas forces the 4th down stop, or the offense coming in clutch against TCU, where if Texas has to punt on that 3rd and long, TCU might win and kick Texas out of the CFP. But they didn't. Texas last year, while at times being seemingly trying to choke their way out of the playoff, didn't. They won some close games. They dominated Alabama, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State. They nearly came back and beat Washington, who was one of the clutchest teams last season and one of the clutchest teams that I've seen in the 2020s, managing all those one-possession games. So Texas does have good reasons to be considered an SEC contender. They do. I've documented previously on this channel the fact that I think Texas is going to have a much rougher time in the SEC than most people think, but that's my personal opinion and I can be wrong. However, they return 10 starters, much like Oregon, so in comparison to Ohio State, who returns more, there's a disadvantage there. They bring in 11 transfers, Silas Bolden and Isaiah Bond at wide receiver, Amari Niblack at tight end, and they bring in some others too. They bring in a lot on defense. They bring in Makuba from Clemson, great safety, started at Clemson, in fact, but I think he wanted better opportunities, more money, so he transferred in. Most of Texas's offensive line, along with Quinn Ewers, returns. Tight end, receiver, Jonathan Brooks at running back, Xavier Worthy included at receiver, they're all gone. But the offensive line at Texas, their center Majors, Kelvin Banks at tackle, and again Quinn Ewers, they come back. And Texas was not elite at defensive end last season. Up front, their front four did a much better job of stopping the run than getting to the quarterback, but they realized that and they dipped into the portal and they got Trey Moore, who posted 14 sacks last season and at UTSA was the American Defensive Player of the Year, first team All-American. And by All-American, I mean All-American Conference, not All-American, one of the best players in the country. Though if he posts those numbers at Texas, he will certainly be an All-American this season. So I'm interested in seeing how he pans out, in particular on this Longhorn defense. I think that he makes that room, the edge group, a strength. And if Ewers improves, he was barely outside the top 15 in QBR last year, or maybe he was barely inside. He was around that 15th range, inside the top 20. If he takes that next step, gets into the top 10, with the depth that Texas has at quarterback, plus Ewers playing at his ceiling, that's definitely one of the best quarterback rooms in the country if those two boxes are checked off. So quarterback can be a strength. I'm not ready to just tab it as one, though, given that Ewers has been inconsistent, sometimes consistently inconsistent, over the past two seasons. I think that defensive tackle, though, and corner are weaknesses, if not weaknesses, at least questions. I don't think Bill Norton and two other defensive tackle transfers from Louisville, and I forget where the other one transferred in from. Maybe it was also Arizona. I don't think that they're going to be as good as Murphy and Sweat, especially with Bo Davis leaving for LSU. Two of the best defensive tackles in the country, along with arguably one of the nation's, if not the nation's, best defensive line coach leaving that room. That area is bound to take a step back. Maybe it's not, but that's how I see it in my mind, especially because in regards to Texas's football program, I need to see more seasons like last season's in the SEC before I give parts of the team, especially outside of the offense, which is Sarkisian's specialty, benefit of the doubt. The O-line at Texas is probably one of the few areas, along with receiver, that I will give benefit of the doubt to. They've had great receivers over the past few seasons, and their O-line under Kyle Flood is getting better and better and better. I can't say that about the defense. And with Terrence Brooks leaving, even with some incoming transfers and returning starters, that secondary was so bad, given the talent and the fact that the Big 12 on offense just isn't as strong as it used to be, particularly when TCU and Baylor and the later Bob Stoops era and Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma, those offenses were elite, and humming. Oklahoma did not have that type of offense last season. Texas was too inconsistent at times for that, and Kansas wasn't healthy. So, given the opponents that secondary faced and the talent they have, I got to think it's coaching and not just recruiting or not just youth. So that's an area of question as well. I think they'll take a step back at those positions, and I would say corner has some concerns with depth as well. I like Makuba transferring in from Clemson. Clemson knows how to develop defensive players. He's been there for quite some time, started, and he'll make a great addition for Texas. But we'll have to see how that entire room and really the defense overall pans out, especially since the SEC has gotten better and better on offense. And they play Georgia, who should have the best offense in the SEC this season. And last but not least, we have the Ohio State Buckeyes, who is the center point of this video. This team, I'm telling you right now, and you can believe me, you cannot, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and I will admit that I'm wrong. I've done this a bajillion times on my channel, like any honest college football analyst does when reevaluating his preseason predictions. Preseason predictions are so hard to nail. I nailed Michigan winning the national title last year and Washington being one of the best teams in the country, winning the Pac-12 and reaching the playoff, even though I picked Oregon to win the Pac-12 when championship game preview came. So, yeah, that's probably as close as I can get to making a bombshell of accurate predictions. Same with completely predicting the Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan records against each other. That's probably the closest I can get to having awesome preseason predictions. I'm going to try and get better this year, and every year it'd be awesome for when it comes to a subset of multiple teams to have perfect predictions, but that's very unrealistic. But this is one that I'm very confident on. And the more I look into the staffs of these teams, same thing applies. I've been studying Big Ten staffs because that's the focus of this channel. So for Texas, I don't know a ton about their staff in the same way that I do about Ohio State and Oregon, for example. But Ohio State's staff has really course-corrected in a beautiful way after their losses to Michigan outside of the strength and conditioning position. And even there, they're good. Mickey Marotti is a great strength and conditioning coach. I just don't think that he's elite. And if you want to be number one in the country, you got to be elite at everything if you want a dynasty. And Ohio State expects to have a dynasty. The Buckeyes last year continued their run of 11-2 seasons, the third in a row. Now, for most schools, that's a dynasty right there. But for Ohio State, that is pathetic, rather. It was the second year in a row where they started 11-0 and finished 0-2. 0-2 against top 10 opponents specifically. Last year, or for Missouri, they technically weren't ranked in just inside the top 10, I believe, or maybe they were 10th when the final CFP rankings were out. They may have been 11th or 12th. I forget. So if you want to say top 15, fine. In 2022, it was number 1 Georgia, number 3 Michigan were their final losses of that season. So very painful. And their games against Michigan, Missouri, and Georgia, 3 out of the 4, were very close games. Definitely winnable, just on a different day. They were 3rd in FPI after being ranked 1st in FPI for much of the season, 4th in efficiency, and they played a tough schedule. Missouri in the bowl game, Notre Dame on the road, Wisconsin on the road, and of course, Penn State and Michigan, the 2 best teams that they played all season long. They had a top 15 offense by efficiency, and by scoring defense, it was the number 2 defense in the country. Per ESPN's efficiency, Ohio State had the 3rd best defense behind Clemson and Michigan. I respectfully disagree. I think their defense was much better than Clemson's defense, but that's beside the point. Just wanted to give some efficiency stats along with scoring stats for the Bucks. And from last year, very similar to Texas and Oregon. They return just around that 2/3 level of production. But they don't move conferences. And Ohio State has consistently built upon several top 5, top 3 recruiting classes. In fact, their 2021 recruiting class, a lot of their commits are still with Ohio State. And that was the number 2 recruiting class in college football and one of the best recruiting classes of all time in regards to average rank per player. They just had less commits than Alabama. That's why they were ranked lower than Alabama's recruiting class that year, which was 1. Theirs was 2. But Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau were a part of that class. Travion Henderson was, Emeka Egbuka. All of these players are seniors. I don't think any of them were redshirted. I mean, they are awesome, especially in regards to Henderson and Egbuka, and now I'd say Sawyer. Awesome college football players. And Ohio State, while not returning the same amount of production as Oregon and Texas, I will tell you, a massive part of that. See, you can't just rely on returning production, and you can't just rely on returning starters. You have to look at both. Michigan State returned a ton of production from 21 to 22, for example, but it was bad production. Their returning production was mostly from their defense, not their offense. Their defense was the weak point. The area that returned the most production was the secondary, which was one of the worst in the country. And you could see just from those returning production stats that you couldn't take that as a positive with how bad that group is. That's part of my complaint with Texas. A lot of their secondary production returns, but their secondary was terrible. It was an atrocity given the talent they had. For Ohio State, what they lose in returning production outside of their linebackers and Josh Proctor and Marvin Harrison Jr. is Kyle McCord. And Kyle McCord wasn't good enough to be Ohio State's starting quarterback. Now, he was a good, great quarterback, but at Ohio State, they need elite. I don't know if they're getting elite out of Will Howard, but what I will tell you is Dylan Gabriel, one of the best quarterbacks in the country. He's a sixth-year college football player. His upside's limited. I think that's a part of the reason why he left Oklahoma. Yeah, he's one of the best, in my opinion, in college football, but I don't exactly think that Oklahoma believes that's the case, and they were going to have a tight competition with him and Jackson Arnold, who might prove me wrong and be one of the better quarterbacks in college football this season. We'll have to see. That's the beauty of this sport. And Quinn Ewers has been inconsistent for 2 years. Will Howard, much like Gabriel, sixth-year player, doesn't have the same amount of achievements under his belt, the same statistics, but Ohio State, outside of the offensive line, their running back, wide receiver rooms, and also their QB room. Will Howard, I don't know if he'll win the starting job. It's likely, but they could have Julian Sayin step up to the plate. Maybe Devin Brown pushes. I don't exactly know. They have the same depth at that position that Texas does, if not potentially more depth. But I don't think they have the same caliber of starter if we're assuming Will Howard starts. Because I think Quinn Ewers and Gabriel are better than Howard. But again, like all of these preseason predictions, these are just hypotheses, if that's the plural term. They're just educated guesses. But Ohio State returning more starters is huge. Them recruiting slightly better, higher quality players than Texas and Oregon. And returning the same production. And having, in my opinion, a much better head coach. Lanning and Sark were ranked ahead of Day in ESPN's top 10 coaching list. That's asinine. I mean, that is straight up, it's wrong. That's what it is. It's straight up wrong. Day is 56-8, and I'm sorry. Sarkisian, Lanning, what big win do they have that is more impressive than Day's win over 2020 Clemson? Or more impressive than Day's loss to one of the better teams of all time in 2022 Georgia? You can't name it. Beating Alabama in Tuscaloosa is impressive, but that was Saban's worst Alabama team since maybe his second year there. And Dan Lanning, 0-3 against Washington, arguably the best team that his Ducks have played in the Pac-12 when he's there. And against Georgia, and this is the first game of the season, so I'm not going to hold it against him, 3-49. Sark and Lanning are younger at their respective jobs than Day is at his. Sarkisian has had 2 seasons in 21 and 22 that wildly underperformed expectations or underperformed their potential. Lanning has had game management issues that are at least as bad as Day's. And on top of that, Ohio State returns more starters. Ohio State's receiver core, I think, will be just as good as Oregon and Texas's, and those are the strengths of those two schools as well. Ohio State with Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson at running back. That'll be better than Oregon's Jordan James and Noah Whittington. It'll be better than Texas's running back room with Jaden Blue and I think Cedric Baxter. I could be wrong, and for any Texas fan watching this, I apologize. I'm not as knowledgeable about Texas as I am Ohio State and Oregon. So take from that what you will, but I'm not dumb in regards to Texas football either. And at defensive tackle, Ohio State returns theirs, Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams. They return JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer. And they have the best secondary in the country coming back, bringing in Caleb Downs, Denzel Burke, Jordan Hancock. They come back. Lathan Ransom comes back. Running back, wide receiver, defensive tackle, defensive end, corner, and safety. Those are all strengths. And with Cody Simon, CJ Hicks, and Sonny Styles at linebacker, that could be one of the better linebacker rooms in the country despite both starters leaving. And quarterback, depending on whether Will Howard has the best season of his career or a high-ceiling player who's quickly growing in Saiyan starts or Devin Brown rebounds, quarterback can be a strength as well. The difference between Ohio State and Texas and Oregon, and this is where I can see the Longhorns being better than the Buckeyes, is the offensive line. The offensive line is so critical in college football, and Ohio State has recruited and developed for collegiate purposes rather poorly there, especially in the past season and I'd argue the past two recruiting cycles. Offensive center with Seth McLaughlin, potentially Carson Hinsman, that's an area with big questions. Same with offensive tackle with Josh Simmons, who's the most penalized offensive tackle in college football, who's active, and Josh Fryer is also questionable. And guard, Donovan Jackson's probably the strongest and best member of that offensive line, but there are questions at guard too. And tight end could be weak links as well, but I think with the talent at those positions, those could also be strengths. And even if Oregon and Texas have better O-lines, and the likelihood says that they will, Ohio State will be better everywhere compared to those two schools at every defensive position. I'd take an all-around superior number 2, number 1, more likely number 1 defense over offensive lines that will be great, near elite, or elite, but there's questions on the entire defensive side of the ball. I mean, Georgia won the 2021 and 2022 national titles. Same with Michigan in 23. The past 3 national champions won because of defense and also because of their offensive lines. Make no mistake, the O-line's very important. But at the end of the day, TCU and Washington's high-powered speed offenses that cut through some of the better defenses statistically in the country were halted by generational or near-generational defenses. Alabama's offense with Bryce Young was literally beaten to death. Like, look at John Mechie and Jamison Williams going down, playing those Georgia defenses because they hit hard, they tackle, they don't give up. Outside of that one game in the 2021 SEC championship game, Georgia's defense didn't break. And whether it's Bama in 2020 or LSU in 2019, if you're going to win with offense, you have to have the best college quarterback and the best collegiate wide receivers. And that is something that no school, none, should bet on having. Because take Ohio State's word of advice, for example. They had that in 2022, and it wasn't good enough. And I don't think Quinn Ewers or Dylan Gabriel, all respect in the world to them, are not as good as Stroud or Burrow or Mac Jones in college. And none of those receivers are Devonta Smith, are Marvin Harrison Jr., etc. So that's my case. I think it is completely asinine that especially Texas and also Oregon are ranked ahead of Ohio State in the preseason. I mean, look at whether it's Nebraska, Missouri, Texas A&M, Colorado moving away from the Big 12. What have they won? I mean, yeah, Missouri and Colorado and Nebraska have been to conference championship games. They have not been awful programs every season, but Nebraska has not gone bowling since 2016. Colorado, outside of that 2016 season, hasn't been very good at all. And Missouri, they fell on hard times after Gary Pinkel retired and before Eli Drinkwitz's best season at Missouri last year. Texas A&M has gotten even worse, or at least stayed steady. They haven't changed or improved joining the SEC in terms of wins and losses. I just look And it's not a guarantee that Texas and Oregon are going to be dominating these conferences. I'd say that it's closer to a guarantee than not that they'll be contending for these conference championships. But Ohio State and Georgia, just roster wise, what they return and who they are, and by the fact that they're implanted in their conference, meanwhile, Oregon and Texas are trying to find new land to harvest, new land to take root in. It'll be hard to overthrow Georgia and Ohio State in year one, especially when their rosters are better and their coaches are better than what's coming in. And Oregon and Texas are really, really good. I'm not saying they're terrible. I'm just saying the realms that they are entering are challenging and have even better elite cream of the crop players and programs. Thank you all so much for watching. Please remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this commentary down below. Thank you to Crash2488 and Braska Rascal for sponsoring this video as Heisman patrons. Thanks to Chris Lane, Connor Little OH for sponsoring this video and channel's All-American patrons. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for sponsoring this video as all-conference patrons. Have a phenomenal day, guys, and I will see you all very soon. Bye-bye.